In a very peculiar and special way, Western man is hung up on sex. The major reason for this is his religious background, which is quite unique among the religions of the world. I mean specifically Christianity, and in a secondary way Judaism, insofar as Judaism in Europe and the United States is strongly influenced by Christianity. Of all religions in the world, Christianity is the one that is most uniquely preoccupied with sex, more so than tantric yoga or any kind of fertility cult that has ever existed on the face of the earth. There has never been a religion in which sexuality was so important. In popular speech, when you say a person is living in sin, you know very well that you do not mean that they are engaged in a business to defraud the public by the sale of badly made bread or setting up a check forgery business. People who are living in sin are those who have an irregular sexual partnership. In the same way, when you say something is immoral, it most often means something sexually irregular. When I was a boy in school, I remember we used to have a preacher who came every once in a while, and he talked about the subject of drinking and gambling and immorality. The way he rolled around his tongue, it was very clear what immorality was. Most churches in America, England, and other parts of the Western world are, frankly, sexual regulation societies and precious little else. They occasionally get excited about other moral issues, but really not very often. To prove this, you only have to ask what people can be thrown out of church for. A person can live in envy, hatred, malice, and all uncharitableness and still be in perfectly good standing. But the moment anything about their sexual life becomes a little unusual, out they go. And that is about the only thing for which they can be removed. For example, the Roman Catholic manuals of moral theology are technical books about sins of all kinds, what they are, how they are done, how grave they are, mostly for the advice of confessors. They are always arranged according to the Ten Commandments, and thou shalt not commit adultery occupies 2/3 of the whole book, with all the details. In a very special way, we've got sex on the brain, which is not exactly the right place for it. This needs examination because it is not as simple as it looks. There are really two roots of the problem. One of them is the question of why, of all pleasures, religious people are particularly afraid of sexual pleasure. This is not true only of Christianity. Christianity emphasizes it in a certain way, but in Asian religions also, and especially in India, there is a prevailing view that if you want to attain real heights of spirituality, the one thing you must give up is sexuality, in the ordinary sense of genital sexual relationships. This reflects an attitude to the physical world, because it is through sexuality that we have, along with eating, our most fundamental relationship to materiality, to nature, to the physical universe. It is also the point at which we can become most attached to the body, to the physical organism, and to material life. That is one reason why sexuality is problematic. The other reason, which is more subtle, is that sexuality is something you cannot get rid of. Do what you may, life is sexual, in the sense that you are either male or female. There are various other graduations, but basically they are all forms of maleness and femaleness. And of course, every one of you is the result of sexual intercourse. This sexual feature of life can be looked at in one of two ways. You can say, on the one hand, that all man's higher ideals, his spirituality and so forth, are simply repressed sexuality. On the other hand, you can say that human sexuality is a physical manifestation, a particular form of expression of what is spiritual, metaphysical, or divine. I hold to the latter view. I do not think that religion is repressed sexuality. Sexuality is just one of the many forms in which whatever all this is expresses itself. And sexuality is something you cannot get rid of. A way of life in which sexuality is in some way put down or repressed is nonetheless an expression of sexuality. If you realize this, then you come to a view of Christianity in which sex is a very special and unusual taboo. And sex is taboo in Christianity. There's simply no getting around that. Up-to-date ministers today say sex is alright if you are married and you have a mature relationship with a member of the opposite sex. But if you read anything in Christian writings prior to approximately 1850, you will find that it is not alright at all. It is tolerated between married couples for the procreation of children, but on the whole it is best to do without. As St. Paul put it, it's better to marry than to burn in hell. And all the writings of the Church Fathers, from St. Paul himself to St. Ignatius Loyola to any of the great relatively modern leaders of Catholic spirituality, to Calvin and the great Protestants like John Knox, on the whole sex is sin and sex is dirt. You can say very simply that this is very wrong, but I want to point out that there is another side to sexual prohibition. There is no way of making a hedge grow like pruning it. There is no way of making sex interesting like repressing it. Therefore, as a result of all these centuries of sexual repression and associating it with dirt, the West has developed a peculiar form of eroticism. That is an aspect of the whole problem that I do not think is really very profitable to explore, but I just want to mention in passing that the whole attitude of anti-sexuality in the Christian tradition is not as anti as it looks. It's simply a method of making sex prurient and exciting in a kind of dirty way. I suppose it is to be recommended to people who are not feeling very frisky and need to be pepped up. The other side of the problem is much more interesting. That is, why is pleasure a problem for human beings? We take sexual activity to be a supreme pleasure, and as a supreme involvement of oneself with the body in the physical world. Why should there be a problem with that? The answer is simply that the physical world is transient and impermanent. It falls apart. Bodies that were once smooth, strong, and lovely wither and become corrupt and turn at last into skeletons. If you cling to one of those bodies and it suddenly turns into a skeleton in your arms, it will be as like you sped up time a little and you will feel cheated. There has been for centuries a lament about this. Life is so short and all the beauties of the world falls apart. Therefore, if you are wise, you do not set your heart on mortal beauty, you set your heart on spiritual values that are imperishable. Even Omar Khayyam says, "The worldly hope men set their dreams upon turns to ashes, or it prospers, and anon, like snow upon the desert's dusty face, lightning a little hour or two is gone." So don't bet on that horse. If you read any kind of spiritual literature, whether Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, or Taoist, you will find that they all seem to emphasize the importance of detachment from the body, from the physical world, so that you won't be engulfed in the stream of impermanence. The idea is that to the degree that you identify yourself with the body and with the pleasures of the body, you are simply identifying with something that will be sucked away in the course of transience. Therefore, hold yourself aloof, advise many Hindus who practice yoga, and look on all sensory experiences as something out there that you simply witness. You are to identify with yourself with the eternal, spiritual, unchanging self, the witness of all that goes on, and are to be no more involved in the transitory than a mirror is involved in the things it reflects. Keep your mind pure and clean, free from dust, free from flaws, free from stain, and like a mirror just reflect everything that goes on without being attached. It has always seemed to me that this attitude of essential detachment from the physical universe raises then the very serious question of why then have a physical universe at all? If God is in some way responsible for the existence of creation, and if this creation is basically a snare, why did he do it? According to some theologians, the physical universe is looked on as a mistake, as a fall from the divine state, as if something went wrong in the heavenly domain, causing spirits such as we are, in fact, to fall from their highest state and become involved with animal bodies. This is an ancient analogy, which runs right through to the present time, that your relationship to your body is that of a rider to a horse. St. Francis called his body Brother Ass. You are a rational soul in charge of an animal body, and therefore if you belong to the old school, you beat it into submission. Or if you are a Freudian, you treat your horse not with a whip, but kindly, with lumps of sugar, but it is still your horse. Even in Freud, there is a very strong element of Puritanism. Read Philip Reif's book, Freud, the Man of the Moralist. In it he shows that Freud basically thought that sex was something degrading, though nevertheless unavoidable and terribly necessary, which could not be swept aside, but had to be dealt with. But there is still in this the heritage of thinking of ourselves as divided, of the ego as the rational soul of spiritual origin, and the physical body as the animal component. Therefore, in this heritage, all spiritual success requires the spiritualization of the animal component, the sublimation of its dirty and strange urges. I suppose the ideal sexual relationship of such persons would be held on an operating table under disinfectant sprays. Of course, it is true that the physical world and its beauty is transient. We are falling apart in some way or another, especially after we pass the peak of youth. But this has never struck me as something to gripe about. That the physical world is transient seems to be a part of its splendor. I can imagine nothing more awful than attaining the age of 30 and suddenly being frozen in that age for always. You could become a kind of animated waxwork, people with a physical permanence that would feel like a plastic. As a matter of fact, that is what is going to be done about us by technology in order to provide perpetual youth. All the parts of our bodies that decay and fold up are going to be replaced by very skillfully manufactured plastic parts, so that in the end we will be entirely made up of very sophisticated plastic. Everybody will feel like plastic and everybody will be utterly bored with each other, because the very fact that the world is decaying and falling away is the source of its very vitality. Vitality is change. Life is death. It is always falling apart. There are certain supreme moments when, in the body, we obtain superb vitality. It is just like when an orchestra is playing and the conductor wants a certain group of violinists to come in at a certain moment, and they do. It is the whole art of life, to do it at the right time. In the same way, when it comes to love, sexuality, or equally all the pleasures of gastronomy, timing is of the essence. You have them for a moment, and then they are gone, but that is not something that one should look on with regret. It is regrettable only if you don't know how to accept it when its moment arrives. This is really the essence of what I want to talk about, because to be detached from the world in the sense that Buddhists and Taoists and Hindus often talk about detachment does not mean to be non-participative. You can have a very rich and full sexual life and yet all the time be detached. By that I do not mean that you just go through it mechanically and have your thoughts elsewhere. I mean a complete participation but still detached. The difference between the two attitudes is this. On the one hand, there is a way of being so anxious about physical pleasure, so afraid that you won't make it, that you grab it too hard and destroy it completely. After every failed attempt to get it, you feel disappointed and empty. You feel something was lost, and so you have to keep repeating. This is the hang-up. This is what is meant by attachment to the world. In the negative sense of the word, pleasure in its fullness cannot be experienced when one is grasping it. I knew a little girl to whom everybody gave a bunny rabbit. She was so delighted with it and so afraid of losing it that, taking it home in the car, she squeezed it to death. Lots of parents do that to their children and to each other. They hold on too hard, and so take the life out of this transient, beautifully fragile thing that life is. To have life and its pleasure, you must at the same time let it go. Then you can feel perfectly free to have that pleasure in the most gutsy, rollicking, earth-shaking, lip-licking way, with one's whole being taken over by a kind of undulative, compulsive ripple, like the very pulse of life itself. But this can happen only if you let it go, if you are willing to be abandoned. The word abandoned is funny. We speak of people who are dissolute as being abandoned, but abandoned is also a characteristic of a saint. A great spiritual look by a Jesuit father is called Abandonment to Divine Providence. There are people who are just not hung up. There are those who, out of their spirituality, do not cling to any property. They do not carry burdens around. They are free, and just that sort of let-go-ness is quite essential for the employment of any kind of pleasure at all, and particularly sexual pleasure. I do not know how typical this would be of children brought up in a religious environment in the United States, but my experience as a boy in school was quite fascinating, and for that I think I have an idea. When a child is baptized and is too young to know anything about its meaning, its godfather and godmother are the sponsors. When you are about to enter into puberty, however, you are confirmed, you yourself undertake your own baptismal vows, and confirmation into the Church of England, which is Episcopalian in its own country. Confirmation is preceded by instruction. In England, this instruction consisted very largely of lessons in church history, because the British approach to religion is particularly archaeological. Based on the great Christian saints and heroes of the past. It is really quite interesting, because it somehow associates you with the tradition of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and all that sort of thing. But the time comes when every candidate for confirmation has a private talk with the school chaplain, and every process of initiation into mysteries from time immemorial there has been the passing on of a secret. So there is a certain anticipation about this very private communication, because you would think that being initiated into a religion, the secret would consist of some marvelous information about the nature of God or the fundamental reason for being, but it is not so. Instead, the initiatory secret talk is a serious lecture on the evils of masturbation, what these evils were was not clearly specified, but it was vaguely hinted that ghastly diseases would result. So, in a perverse sort of way, we candidates for confirmation usually used to enjoy tormenting ourselves with imagining what kind of terrible diseases, venereal disease, epilepsy, tuberculosis, or the Great Siberian Itch would result from this practice. In America, I cannot speak for most other churches, as I was raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a Mormon, and it was a very different experience. But I will not go into it here, because Mormonism is of itself essentially Christian, but most Christians in the mainstream do not agree that it is, and so I will not talk about it here, since I am only talking about mainstream Christianity. And in order to talk about that, I must talk about Catholicism and somewhat the Church of England. The extraordinary thing is that the chaplain for the Church of England in the schools who gave these lectures had, in his own upbringing, being given the same lecture by other chaplains, and I imagine this went back some distance in history. Of course, they all knew perfectly well that one of the characteristic behavior patterns of adolescence is ritual defiance of authority. You have to make some protest against authority, and in doing so you are in league with all your contemporaries, your peer group. Nobody would dream of giving anybody else away, because then he would be a tattletale, a skunk, and definitely not one of the boys. Therefore, obviously, masturbation provided the ideal outlet for his ritual defiance because it was fun, it was also an assertion of masculinity, and it was very, very wicked. In the religious background of the Western world, we have mainly two traditions. One is Semitic and the other is Greek. So far as the Semitic tradition is concerned, the material world and sexuality are definitely good things. Both Jews and Muslims think that God's creation of beautiful women was a grand idea. The perfumed garden, the Arabic book, that is the Islamic version of the Kama Sutra, opens with a prayer to Allah, that is a very full, detailed thanksgiving for the loveliness of woman, with which Allah has blessed mankind. In the book of Proverbs, we are enjoined to enjoy our wives while they are young. But even so, on the whole, it is the Semitic belief that sexuality is justified solely for purposes of reproduction. This is what makes it good in the eyes of God, and that is the limitation put on it. Sexual energy should not really be wasted for other purposes. In contrast to this, we have a Greek tradition that was strongly influenced by a dualistic view of the universe, in which material existence is conceived of as a trap, a fall into turgid, clogging matter that is antagonistic to the lightness and freedom of the spirit. Therefore, for certain kinds of Greek religions, among which we must name the Orphic mysteries, the Neoplatonic point of view and the late agnostic points of view, being saved means being delivered from material existence into a purely spiritual state. From this point of view, sexual involvement is the very archetype of material environment. Martyr, mother, mater, and matter are really the same word, so the love of a woman is the same great snare. This is, incidentally, a doctrine invented by man. It goes back to the words of Adam, "The woman that thou gavest me, she tempted me, and I did eat." And the development of Christian theology from approximately the time of St. Paul through the beginning of the Renaissance, it was universally held that sex was a bad thing. Read St. Augustine. He said that in the Garden of Eden before the fall, reproduction took place in just the same place and with just the same lack of excitement as one excretes or passes water. There is no shameful excitation of the sexual parts. The whole attitude of the Church Fathers in those centuries was that the virgin state was immensely superior spiritually to the marriage state, and that sexual relationships were excusable only within the bonds of marriage and for the sole purpose of reproduction. The manuals and moral penitentiaries of the theologians of the Middle Ages list all sorts of penances that must be said, even by married couples who perform sexual intercourse on the night before attending Mass or receiving Holy Communion. Of course, sex must be avoided completely on certain great church festivals, although in theory marriage is a sacrament that somehow blesses this peculiar relationship. There is a definite attitude that even within the sacrament, sex is still dirty and not very nice. You must realize also that in those days the institution of marriage was not what it is today. Marriage at the time of the rise of Christianity was a social institution for creating alliances between families. You did not marry the person of your choice except under the most unusual circumstances. You married the girl your family picked out for you, and they thought it over carefully from its political point of view, as well as from the point of view of eugenics and economics. You married this girl even though you were not necessarily in love with her, and it was perfectly well understood in the secular world that on the side you had other arrangements. If you could afford them, you could have concubines, or even second and third and fourth wives. There was somewhat more freedom of choice about those subsidiary wives. But the first one was definitely a family arrangement. That is the context of the Church's saying that only that woman whose marriage has been arranged by paternal authority should be your bedfellow. The idea of romantic love does not arrive in connection with marriage until the troubadour cults of Provence in southern France in the late Middle Ages. Then begins the idealization of the woman as the inspiring goddess, and also the idea of the knight-errant. Dante's Beatrice is the inspiring woman who leads him to heaven. Historians today are not agreed as to whether the lady loves of the chivalrous knights were in fact their mistresses or were simply idealized women. But the influence of the cult of romantic love on the West was profound, and it brought about a weird combination of ideas. First, the notion of the married state being the only licit relationship in which sexual play might be carried on, and second, the notion that the girl you marry should be the one with whom you have fallen in love. Two more ill-adjusted ideas could hardly be put together, because naturally, when you love somebody very much indeed, and your enthusiasm to become involved, you say things that are hardly logical or rational. You may stand up before an altar and say, "My darling, my sweetheart, my perfect pet, I adore you so much that I will live with you forever and ever until death do us part." Although this is the way you feel at the time, this level of enthusiasm may not last. In a rather similar mood, ancient people would hail their kings and say, "O king, live forever." Obviously, this was not meant literally, they were just wishing him a long life. The trouble was that when the kind of extravagant poetic expression fell into the hands of people like Augustine, who were rather influenced by Roman literalists, they wrote it into the law books. Thereby an amazing situation came about, and we still have not fully explored its subtlety. Consider certain periods when this attitude of prudery towards sexuality was in ascendancy. Nearest to our time is the bourgeois revolution in Victorian England and in the United States. Victorian is usually a term of invective indicating extreme monogamy and a definite disgust for all things sexual. Yet, when really examining the history of the Victorian period, we find that it is extremely lascivious. One has only to look at the lushness of Victorian furniture to realize that chairs were disguised women. Even the way piano legs were shaped reflects this influence. People like Freud and Havelock Ellis made a certain mistake. They said that the church and religion in general was nothing but a form of sublimated sex. They said, for whatever curious reasons, these people suppressed sex, and therefore it became a very powerful force for them. To understand this, you must remember that they used a hydraulic analogy of human psychology. They likened it to a river. If you dammed it up, it would burst the dam. It does not actually follow that human psychology is akin to hydraulics, but this is the metaphor Ellis and Freud used. They said, the church has repressed sex, but if you look at its symbolism, you will see that it is actually a robust expression of sexuality. Everything is reduced to libido and the fundamental reality. That's what they said. The church replied to this by saying, it is nothing of the kind. Reducing the church to repressed sex is just a way of attacking holy things, and on the contrary, we would say the people who are fascinated with sex and make it their god are repressing religion. The problem in this debate is that everybody has missed the boat. The church should have said to Freud, "Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, our symbolism is sexual. The steeples of our churches, the vesicle-shaped windows, and the heraldic shields on which we put our images of the crucifix or the Virgin Mother of God, all these are quite plainly sexual. However, the sexual form reveals the mysteries of the universe. Sex is not mere sex. It is a holy thing, and one of our most marvelous revelations of the divine." But the church just could not say that. When one looks at Tibetan Buddhist iconography and images, or Hindu temples, one finds that Europeans and Americans have never been able to understand. Here are images of Buddhas and the gods engaged in amazing diversions with their female counterparts. Everybody thinks that these are dirty sculptures, but they are nothing of the kind. They reveal to the people who look at them that the play of man and woman is, on the level of biology, a reflection of the fundamental play of the cosmos. The positive and negative principles, the light and the dark, the mental and the material, all play together. The purpose of sexual play is not merely the function of reproducing the species, as it seems to be among animals to a very large extent. What peculiarly distinguishes human sexuality is that it brings the partners closer and closer to each other in an intense state of united feeling. In other words, it is a sacrament, the outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace that brings about love. So, as that union seems to be peculiar to human beings, it is perfect nonsense to degrade human sexuality by saying it should only be carried on in the way that animals must, because they have not yet evolved to the place where sex is sacramental expression of love. Falling in love, while considered by practical people to be a sort of madness, is actually the same sort of thing as the mystical vision or grace. In this light we see people in their divine aspect. When the song says, "Every little breeze whispers Louise," it is singing that there is a sort of extraordinary state of mystical intoxication in which every woman becomes a goddess, and likewise every man becomes a god. What happened, however, as a result of this conflict between proponents of religion and the proponents of scientific naturalism, was mutual name-calling. They have never come together because neither the Church nor the opponents of the Church has clearly understood that sexuality and all that goes with it is a triggering forth on the level of biology of what the whole universe is about, and that is ecstatic play. As a result, there has been a kind of compromise. In ecclesiastical circles, sex is being damned with faint praise. People are saying, after all, sex was made by God, and perhaps it is something more than reproduction. It may bring about the cementing of the marriage ties between husband and wife. But in practice it remains the frightening taboo. At the same time, the opposition to Christian prudery always goes overboard in the direction of total license. So we have a contest between the people who want skirt hems down to the floor and people who want them pulled up over the head, and it seems you have to draw the line somewhere. The play between these forces is over the question of where we shall draw the line, and that is very exciting play, providing neither side wins. Imagine what it would be like if the Libertines won and they took over the church on Wednesday evenings so that the young Presbyterian group could meet for prayer through sex. Every child would go to the school physician for a course in hygienics, and they would have classes in plastic models, and then the children would go do it in class in a very hygienic atmosphere. Imagine how boring it would all become in this setting. So the people who say that modesty is important are saying something is quite right. They must not be allowed to prevail, but they must not be obliterated either. In life, the balance of oppositions works that way. To use an entirely different analogy, take a given biological group, a species we call A. It has a natural enemy, B. One day, A gets furious at its natural enemy, B, and says, "Let us obliterate B." They gather their forces and knock out their enemy. After a while, they begin to get weak and overpopulated. There is nobody around to eat up their surplus members, and they do not have to keep their muscles strong to defend against an enemy. They begin to fall apart because they have destroyed their enemy, and they remember that what they should do is cultivate the enemy. That is the real meaning of love your enemy. There is such a thing as a beloved enemy. If the flies and the spiders did not have each other, there would be either too many spiders or too many flies. These balances maintain the course of nature. It is exactly the same with the libertines and the prudes. They need each other. If you have a prudish father and mother, you should be very grateful to them for having made sex so interesting. Still, every generation must react to the one before it, and this keeps the tension going. It is by this play of opposites that we know separation and seek the love that makes the world go round.